welcome to Drum Talk, and today we're going to talk about solid shell snare drums, or one-ply shell snare drums, or monoply shell snare drums. Depends on which way you look at it. And my experience with these drums goes way back to a good friend of mine, Scott Hayes, who I've talked about many times in the past. And I'll never forget being 19 years old and walking into Blue Note Music, where I was teaching drum lessons at the time. And Scott said to me, "Hey, I just picked up this Radio King snare drum." Now, at 19 years old, I didn't know what a Radio King was. I didn't know what the intrigue of a Radio King snare drum was. But over the next 10 years, I would figure out what it was about. And the mystique of a Radio King snare drum was it was a bent one piece of wood shell with reinforcing rings in it. And this is my DMR walnut solid shell snare drum. Anyhow, this snare drum right here has got one-ply walnut and it's got reinforcing rings in it. And that's what makes it such a unique sounding drum. So I copied after a Radio King that my friend Scott had. I liked that look of the Radio King drum, so I went with the Radio King lugs. But the Radio King drum that Scott had goes back to 1939. And he picked it up, it had marine pearl on it, and it really was beat up. Lugs were busted, he had some problems with the strainer. These drums were usually found in attics or basements, or somebody had one in a garage sale, but when you find one, it was like this thing you wanted to have. Now, the other problem with them was they would go out of round. And these snare drums, when they went out of round, it was a lot harder to tune them because they weren't round anymore and the heads didn't sit on the drum right. So if you get some of the older Radio King drums that are not worked on by professionals, then guess what? They don't sound as great as you might think. So my next experience with Scott coming in with a solid shell snare drum was my 30th birthday party. Now, at my 30th birthday party, Scott showed up, and he didn't give me a solid shell snare drum. That would have been a wonderful birthday present, by the way. But what he did was he showed up with a Noble Cooley. And he had a 7x14 Noble Cooley snare drum. And it sounded beautiful. We were banging outside, and beautiful sounding snare drum. One day I would actually have that snare drum from Scott for a season. I used it on my wife's album, Toward the Lamb. And it's beautiful. It was a beautiful maple shelled solid one-ply shell drum, Noble Cooley. And Noble Cooley in the mid 80s started making solid shell snare drums like the Radio Kings. And it became the studio drummer's drum to have. Some of the guys that were playing the Noble Cooley drums, one notable was Phil Collins. And Phil Collins used the piccolo version of it, which was, I think, 3 7/8 or something crazy. It wasn't 3 1/2, but it was not quite 4, so it was somewhere between 4 and 3 1/2 solid shell piccolo snare drum. He had one of those. I think he had a deeper one too, white to match his Gretsch kit, his Gretsch concert tom kit. Beautiful piccolo sound, and that was the sound of the late 80s, was the piccolo snare drum. They were coming in and Phil was using one of those. But a lot of guys, Chris Whitten, the drummer for Paul McCartney and Wings back in the early 90s, used a whole Noble Cooley kit with solid shells. That's a whole nother story. The Noble Cooley Drum Company was making a solid shell drum set at the time. The problem was their dies and tooling didn't allow them to make deep shell drums, so they made a very small, shallow shelled, solid shelled tom-tom, and making a bass drum at the time wasn't possible. My first time with a Noble Cooley snare drum came from my friend Pat O'Donnell, and Pat O'Donnell was like Scott. We traded drums back and forth, and Pat had a black 5x14 solid shell Noble Cooley snare drum that he said he hated. He bought it, he heard it was the coolest drum to have, he played it, he didn't like it, he went back to his Ludwig Superphonic, which has always been his drum of choice. Ludwig Superphonic, Steve Gadd sound, that's Pat's drum. But I was a little more venturesome, so I traded him my D4 and my electronic pads, Lisa's D4, and he got an Elisa's D4 and I got a Noble Cooley and some other stuff. And it became my drum for a long time until one day I was in trading mode and I traded him that back and something else, and all of a sudden he had the drum back for a while, and I said, don't sell that drum. It wasn't 6 months and he sold the drum. It took me till I think 2010 or 11 to get this drum back from Scott Hazen. This drum was the Noble Cooley snare drum that went with Scott Hazen's Noble Cooley kit. And he had a Noble Cooley kit. I'm thinking it's called an Horizon kit. You know, I had this drum kit in my studio for a long time. It's a ply shell drum, and it was a 9x13, 18x22, 16x16 floor tom. I may put some video of me playing that kit on the front end of this video, so you can see that kit. But this was the snare drum that went with it. I finally talked Scott into giving me the 5x14. Like I said before, I had Scott's 7x14 in the early 2000s for a while, and I had another piccolo that Scott had, which was the same one that Phil Collins had, which, by the way, is actually a 3.875 by 14 inch snare drum. So it's like less than 4 inches, but not 3.5 inches for a 14 inch snare drum. And piccolos were what a lot of guys wanted in the 80s. Scott picked up one of those. I had that for a while. I hated that drum. That drum just didn't fit my playing style at all. 7x14, yes, but that drum, no. At the time, I had a Noble Cooley alloy custom drum, which was their 4 7/8 by 14 aluminum snare drum, which is a nice drum. I had some issues with the one that Scott had, with rim issues and the black chipping off of the rims and all that. But I would eventually get a aluminum shell snare drum 6.5 by 14 DMR custom made for me that has a similar shell to that Noble Cooley and has a similar sound to it. But Noble Cooley was known for making solid shell drums. That's the key here. Now, other manufacturers of solid shell drums, one ply drums, the most famous one of all is Johnny Craviotto. And Johnny Craviotto went into the solid shell snare drum business probably around the same time as Noble Cooley started getting into it. And Johnny Craviotto made drums. Johnny Craviotto made drums by a company called Solid Shell Drums, or Solid Drums. And then I think there was a trademark infringement with the Solid name, and they became Select Drums. Or maybe it's vice versa, I can't remember which. But I remember Solid went to Select, and I think then they went out off the map. And Johnny would make solid shell snare drums for companies like DW for the late 90s, early 2000s, and eventually he started his own solid shell snare drum company. So the solid shell tradition comes from Radio Kings through Noble Cooley, now to Johnny Craviotto. A lot of companies make solid shell snare drums. There's a shell manufacturer in the Kansas City area. That's who made the shell for my DMR walnut drum. And I will put that down in the crawl somewhere, what the name of that company was. There's actually companies that make solid shells, so if you're a custom boutique drum company, you can get your shells made for you. But Noble Cooley made their shells, Slingerland made their shells. I know Johnny Craviotto makes his shells. I'm not sure if the Joyful Noise Drum Company or Bennett make their own solid ply shells. They may, and that's a possibility. But there's a lot of solid ply drums today that you can get. I'm going to give you one more drum that I had that was a solid ply, one ply shell snare drum, was Tama. And Tama made a one ply snare drum. I believe it was the late 80s, early 90s, and it had kind of like a tube lug kind of look to it. It was a thinner solid shell. I don't know how they made it. I had one for a very short season. It was another one of those drums Scott gave me, and I learned that I didn't really like it. I believe I have those rims from that drum on my Black Beauty snare drum today. because I kept the rims and trying to find the sound for that drum, I put, you know, regular triple flange rims on it. Most of the, all of the Noble Cooley classic SS drums had die-cast tubes. Now I think today they're making them with triple flange or die-cast, so you can get whatever you like today. But when Noble Cooley was making these drums in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, they would always be die-cast tubes. And die-cast tubes do affect the way the drum sound, I find. And all the Gretsch drums have die-cast tubes. Okay? So, anyhow, this is my journey into solid shell drums. I really love the sound of a solid shell drum. I have this 5x14, I have a 7x14. One more person of note, I met a guy when I was playing with a band called Saved by Grace a long time ago in New York State. And I'll never forget this. I brought my Gretsch kit out, the walnut Gretsch kit with the 20-inch bass drum, the one that's on all my videos lately. And I showed up at this church to play, and the one thing the guy said to me, you got to get a Noble Cooley snare drum. I wish I remember the guy's name, but it stuck in my head for a long time, and eventually I would get a Noble Cooley. And I figured out what it is. They have a certain sound. So let me play this a little bit, because I've been told that if I don't play on these videos, then they don't really count, by my friend Dave Jones. So we'll try to play a little bit. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and thanks for watching Drum Talk and supporting my channel. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.